Gentlemen, I witnessed her behavior myself. She is clearly ineligible for decent society.
Your accusations are unfounded, sir. I intend to make her my...
When Corenza Whitaker heard Lord Ashberry say that no decent man would cross the threshold of Ravenfield House again once her private habits became known, she did not at first turn around. She stood at the edge of the great lawn with one gloved hand resting on the carved horn of her late father's hunting chair and watched the riders gather beneath the pale autumn sky. Hounds strained on their leashes, grooms moved through the mist. Ladies in dark velvet and feathered hats arranged their smiles for spectacle. Gentlemen checked reins, boots, and rifles as if the whole morning existed for their ease. It was her house, her father's land, her dead brother's coverts, her accounts, her servants, her risk. And still a man thought he could bury her in public using only his voice. The second thing she noticed was that the lawn had gone quiet in the way only rich people could make a place quiet, by pretending not to listen while listening with all their strength. Then a rider dismounted before anyone could recover the moment. Dristan Mercer, Duke of Ravenmore, crossed the wet grass without haste, removed his gloves, and came to stand beside her as though the place had always expected him there. 6 years had passed since she had last looked into his face at close range. 6 years since he had believed the worst of her. 6 years since pride, silence, and one unforgivable misunderstanding had driven them apart so completely that even hearing his title spoken in London had once felt like reopening a wound with elegant fingers. Now he stood at her side under all those watching eyes and asked, in a voice low enough to sound intimate and clear enough to be heard by everyone nearest them, "Lady Whitaker, if I request the privilege of riding beside you today, will you deny me before your guests?" Lord Ashberry laughed first, too loud, too certain. "Your Grace, I would advise caution. Miss Whitaker's reputation is not as secure as her invitations suggest." Dristan turned his head then. It was not an angry movement. That would have been easier. Anger can be mocked. Anger can be shared. Anger can be dismissed as temper. This was colder. "The next time you speak of Lady Whitaker's reputation," he said, "do it with evidence sufficient to survive the room." Ashberry's smile faltered. Corenza finally looked at Dristan fully. Time had not softened him. It had refined him into something harder to misread and more dangerous to oppose. He was broader across the shoulders than the last time she had seen him, his dark hair touched by the faintest suggestion of restraint at the temples, his face still severe enough to unsettle a weak man, and still controlled enough to make women imagine gentleness where none had been promised. But it was his eyes that undid her. They were exactly as she remembered, steady, grave, intolerably observant. 6 years ago, those eyes had looked at her as if she were the one honest thing in a dishonest room. 6 years ago, they had also looked away when she needed faith more than admiration. Ashberry, who mistook hesitation for weakness, spread his hands in mocking innocence. "I speak only what half the county already whispers. A lady who dismisses one offer, encourages another, inherits an estate without a husband to steady it, and receives private callers at unusual hours must expect discussion. A lady, a husband to steady it, discussion. Men always preferred their cruelties in words civilized enough to pass through drawing rooms. Corenza felt the old instinct rise, the one that had preserved her through 2 years of probate disputes, one predatory steward, and a tide of gentlemen who called themselves helpful while calculating acreage, signatures, and marriage portions behind their teeth. The instinct was simple. Do not bleed where they can see it. So she smiled, not brightly, not sweetly, just enough to make the nearest women lean in further, disappointed to find her upright. "Then the county is poorly informed," she said. Ashberry's expression sharpened. He had not expected her to answer cleanly. He had expected offense, tears, retreat, anything that would let him claim female instability after male insult. He had been pressing toward this morning for weeks. A month earlier, he had called twice at Ravenfield House with flowers too expensive to be tasteful and concern too rehearsed to be sincere. He had spoken with flattering solemnity of her burdens as an unmarried heiress managing sporting tenants and damaged northern fields after a wet spring. He had offered counsel on litigation, introductions in town, quiet masculine assistance. He had also let his gaze rest on her corridors and land maps longer than courtesy required. When she refused him politely, he returned with greater urgency. When she refused him firmly, he began to speak elsewhere. Now he had chosen the royal hunt itself, her largest public gathering since the inheritance judgment, to force the story into the open. Because scandal works fastest when released into a crowd already dressed for entertainment. Dristan looked from Ashberry to Corenza and seemed, in that instant, to understand more than she had said. He offered his arm, not like a savior, not like a claimant, like a man asking a question whose answer mattered. "Then allow me to improve the county's education," he said. A ripple moved through the lawn. No one missed the meaning. The Duke of Ravenmore did not place himself beside damaged women by accident. A duke did not publicly align himself with a scandal unless he intended either conquest or correction. Corenza knew at once how dangerous his intervention was. If she accepted, people would say she had trapped him. If she refused, Ashberry's poison would continue its work unchecked. If she hesitated too long, society would invent the rest. And beneath all of that, worse than all of that, lay the private truth. She still loved him enough to fear standing near him. "Your Grace," she said evenly, "I would not wish your name inconvenienced by my mourning." That almost smile touched one corner of his mouth. She remembered it from another lifetime. "Then we are fortunate. I dislike convenience." A few people laughed, enough to turn the current of the moment. Ashberry stepped forward. "Surely this performance goes too far. We all know Ravenfield has required stronger guidance since Sir Edwin died. Miss Whitaker has borne the strain bravely, but there are questions." "There are always questions," Dristan said. "The difference lies in who profits from asking them." Silence again. The kind that strips a man faster than shouting. Then, with deliberate calm, Dristan said the words that changed the day. "Since my presence appears to have revived local imagination, let me end speculation before it fattens further. I intend, with Lady Whitaker's permission, to pay my addresses openly." Gasps did what dignity could not prevent. A lady near the hedges almost dropped her field glass. One of the older gentlemen muttered, "Good God." Someone else whispered, "They were attached once, were they not?" Corenza's pulse struck hard enough to make the world tilt for one dangerous second. He intended to court her, publicly, before the county, at her own hunt, in answer to a man who had tried to reduce her to rumor. And just like that, Ashberry's accusation became not proof of her damage, but evidence of his failure. Dristan did not touch her arm. He did not take possession of the scene. He merely stood close enough that every witness understood he was lending his rank to her defense and waiting to see whether she would accept the shield or reject it. Choice. It arrived so rarely and at such cost that it almost felt unreal. Corenza drew one slow breath. "If you pay your addresses, Your Grace," she said, keeping her chin high though her heart was in ruins. I suggest you do so with cleaner timing than 6 years ago. A murmur ran through the crowd. Dristan's gaze never left hers. I have come to admire the cost of delay, he said quietly. I do not intend to repeat it. The hounds cried. A horn sounded from the lower field. The huntmaster, unsure whether he stood inside sport or scandal, glanced helplessly toward Corenza. She ought to have dismissed everyone. She ought to have laughed. She ought to have cut Dristan where he stood for what he had once failed to do. Instead, she placed her fingers lightly on his offered arm. Very well, she said. Ride beside me then. Let us see whether your courage survives breakfast. That was how the royal hunt began, with one spurned suitor humiliated before witnesses, one duke stepping into old fire, and one woman discovering that the man she had spent 6 years trying to forget had just made himself impossible to ignore. If you love historical dramas where a woman under attack refuses to bend, and where love returns not as rescue, but as a dangerous second chance, stay with Quiet Fires of America, because Corenza Whitaker is about to learn that public courtship can be a weapon, a risk, and the beginning of the only truth she has ever wanted. 6 years earlier, before she became mistress of Ravenfield, and before Dristan Mercer learned how expensive pride could be, they had met in a London house full of political boredom and silver too polished to trust. Corenza had been 20. He had been younger than his title's future demanded, and older than his charm admitted. She was not then an heiress of consequence. Sir Edwin Whitaker, her father, still lived. Her elder brother Lionel still held the easy assumption that sons continue what fathers build. Corenza, second and female, had been permitted intelligence because no one thought it dangerous. I have come to admire the cost of delay, he said quietly. I do not intend to repeat it. The hounds cried. A horn sounded from the lower field. The huntmaster, unsure whether he stood inside sport or scandal, glanced helplessly toward Corenza. She ought to have dismissed everyone. She ought to have laughed. She ought to have cut Dristan where he stood for what he had once failed to do. Instead, she placed her fingers lightly on his offered arm. Very well, she said. Ride beside me then. Let us see whether your courage survives breakfast. That was how the royal hunt began, with one spurned suitor humiliated before witnesses, one duke stepping into old fire, and one woman discovering that the man she had spent 6 years trying to forget had just made himself impossible to ignore. If you love historical dramas where a woman under attack refuses to bend, and where love returns not as rescue, but as a dangerous second chance, stay with Quiet Fires of America, because Corenza Whitaker is about to learn that public courtship can be a weapon, a risk, and the beginning of the only truth she has ever wanted. 6 years earlier, before she became mistress of Ravenfield and before Dristan Mercer learned how expensive pride could be, they had met in a London house full of political boredom and silver too polished to trust. Corenza had been 20. He had been younger than his title's future demanded and older than his charm admitted. She was not then an heiress of consequence. Sir Edwin Whitaker, her father, still lived. Her elder brother Lionel still held the easy assumption that sons continue what fathers build. Corenza, second and female, had been permitted intelligence because no one thought it dangerous. Dristan noticed at once what others missed, that she listened harder than she spoke, that she could read the weather of a room before older women named it, that she understood horses, tenants, and account books well enough to embarrass half the men flattering themselves at supper. He courted her without spectacle. a pause at the edge of a ballroom, a letter that answered what she had actually said rather than what a lady was supposed to have meant. A morning ride where he asked whether she preferred country discipline to London brilliance and believed her when she answered yes. She loved him because he seemed to see her whole. He loved her because she made performance impossible. Their break had not come from fading affection. That would have been merciful. It came from manipulation dressed as honor. Late in the spring of their understanding, Corenza's brother lost heavily at cards, then worse on a speculative canal venture he was too embarrassed to name plainly. Sir Edwin concealed the damage long enough to negotiate privately with 2 creditors and 1 family ally. One of those allies was Dristan's uncle, the late Marquess of Ravenmore, a man who believed marriages should stabilize accounts the way iron braces stabilize weak timber. Letters moved, figures shifted. Conversations occurred in rooms Corenza was not invited to enter. Then one evening she overheard enough through a half-closed library door to understand the shape of the bargain being considered. If Ravenmore wished it, the match between Dristan and Corenza could be hurried. Certain debts might be eased, certain obligations softened, certain embarrassing papers allowed to sleep. It was not stated crudely, these things never are, but the meaning was clear. Her marriage had become useful. Corenza withdrew at once, not theatrically, not with tears. She wrote Dristan a restrained note saying family circumstances made any continued understanding impossible, and returned the miniature he had once given her. He came to see her the next day, pale with disbelief and anger carefully mastered. "Have I offended you?" he asked. "No." "Then what changed?" "Everything," she might have said. "The room behind us, the figures no one bothered to hide well enough, the discovery that even with you, I may still be weighed like property." Instead, she said the one thing that guaranteed distance. "I find I cannot marry into a family that counts before it feels." It struck him like a blow. She knew that. She used it anyway. Because she was proud, young, and terrified that if she told him the truth, he would either pity her or defend his family. Because women taught to preserve dignity often choose silence over the possibility of being disbelieved. Because she thought severing the bond would spare them both humiliation. She was wrong. Dristan left without pleading. Weeks later, she heard he had gone north. Then came her father's illness, Lionel's riding accident, the succession crisis no one had imagined because no one had imagined needing her for the role. By the time Sir Edwin died and the entailed arguments began, Corenza had no use for romantic memory. She had land to defend, tenants to reassure, a sporting estate to preserve, and enough male relatives offering to oversee things for her to teach her the exact price of feminine independence in a county that admired it only when it remained decorative. Ravenfield should have passed sideways through 2 impatient cousins who had never cared for the place until the legal language made greed appear plausible. But Sir Edwin, who had been more attentive than she knew, had protected what he could in a revised settlement after Lionel's death. Corenza inherited the house, the sporting rights, and a controlling share in the managed acreage under trusteeship provisions designed to keep predatory husbands and opportunistic kin from immediate seizure. That protection saved her and nearly ruined her. Men resented a woman they could not simply marry around, so they tried subtler tools. Stewards delayed reports. Vendors inflated costs. One neighboring landholder challenged a boundary old enough to have buried his grandfather. A distant cousin hinted in town that Ravenfield's accounts were too intricate for female oversight. Invitations shifted. Sympathy arrived wearing proposals. Corenza learned quickly. She sat with old ledgers until midnight. She spoke to kennel masters and tenant widows and gamekeepers' wives, because truth often moved through kitchens long before it reached studies. She discovered which solicitor billed honestly and which preferred confusion. She dismissed one steward for selling timber favors through a cousin's name and survived the winter gossip that followed. She also learned loneliness in its most polished form. The world praised her endurance exactly as long as it did not require recognizing her authority. Then, in the 6th year after she had lost Dristan, the crown hunt was announced for her county route, and Ravenfield was selected as one of the principal houses for the gathering. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it became opportunity for every watchful vulture within riding distance. Ashberry appeared first. Lord Julian Ashberry was old family enough to pass initial inspection and hungry enough to become dangerous by the second conversation. He had charm of the expensive kind, tailored, lazy, and always half a sentence away from insult. His finances were rumored to be narrower than his clothes suggested. He knew horses, cards, and how to make older ladies call a man lively when they meant untrustworthy. He also knew precisely what Ravenfield represented: an heiress under pressure, a house of consequence, sporting prestige, liquidity hidden inside land. He courted her publicly just enough to make refusal awkward. Then, when she would not be cornered into gratitude, he began cultivating another audience: county wives, idle brothers, a vicar's indiscreet sister, 2 men on the hunt committee, and any servant drunk enough to repeat half-heard nonsense. At first, the whispers were light: that Corenza received riders alone in the map room, that estate business gave her an unfeminine taste for privacy, that one dismissed steward had once left Ravenfield after midnight by the library door, that she kept no proper female chaperone when reviewing kennel accounts, that grief had made her proud, that pride had made her careless. None of it was enough on its own. That is how reputations are actually destroyed, not by a single lie, but by many small suggestions laid carefully until decent people begin to feel clever repeating filth as concern. Corenza sensed it before she could prove it. Invitations carried new temperatures. Married women who once asked after her dogs now asked after her household arrangements. A colonel's wife twice hinted that a strong male alliance would quiet the county. One banker suddenly requested additional assurances for a short bridge note on field repairs, though Ravenfield had never failed a payment. Then she found a copy of a private memorandum folded inside correspondence from her London man of business. The original inquiry, written in another hand, asked whether Miss Whitaker's domestic circumstances rendered long-term estate management uncertain, and whether future borrowing should be understood in light of a likely matrimonial adjustment. Matrimonial adjustment, a financial phrase for female capture. The hand was not Ashberry's, but she knew the style of the trap. He was testing the market value of her damage before forcing the rest. And so, on the morning of the hunt, he chose to say aloud what he had been feeding privately for weeks. What he had not expected was Dristan. Corenza had known Ravenmore would attend the larger royal circuit. A duke could not remain absent from a gathering like this without encouraging commentary of another sort. She had not expected him to arrive at Ravenfield 2 days early, nor had she expected the old steadiness in herself to vanish at the sight of him stepping down from his carriage beneath the portico while rain silvered the stone. He bowed correctly. She welcomed him correctly. They spoke of roads, weather, dogs, and royal scheduling like 2 people whose hearts had never once been put to the knife. Then he looked at her over the candlelight that first dinner and said, "You have been fighting alone too long." She nearly broke her glass. "Your Grace mistakes management for distress." "I mistake nothing," he said. The same words 6 years later would return on the hunt lawn and strike even deeper. Their truce before the public clash was brittle, edged, and impossible not to feel. He watched too closely. She answered too sharply. Neither mentioned London. Neither mentioned the returned miniature. Neither mentioned that once, before pride did its work, he had kissed the inside of her wrist in a conservatory and promised never to make her feel bargained over. He had failed that promise, without ever knowing exactly how. She had punished him for it without allowing him the facts. Now, Ashberry's attack stripped away the luxury of old avoidance. The hunt moved after Dristan's declaration, but the day no longer belonged to sport. It belonged to arrangement. He rode beside Corenza through the first covert and the second rise, speaking little at first because too much witness surrounded them. Yet witness was also the point. Every field, every turn of the bridle path, every pause at a hedge announced the same thing. The Duke of Ravenmore had chosen his side. At breakfast tents set along the south paddock, older ladies inspected them with ravenous delicacy. Younger men calculated whether Ashberry had overplayed his hand. One viscountess approached Corenza with exaggerated warmth and said how relieved everyone must be to see such old friends restored. Corenza smiled in the manner of a woman using lace to hide a blade. Some friendships survive longer than rumors, Lady Tresham. It is a pity the reverse is so often attempted. Dristan almost smiled into his coffee. Ashberry, far from chastened, doubled down. By noon, he had drawn two gentlemen into loud discussion near the gun-room about imprudent female governance and the need for estates to be anchored by masculine steadiness. One of those gentlemen later repeated, within convenient hearing of three matrons, that Ravenfield's papers were likely too disordered for any lady to comprehend. Corenza heard him. So did Dristan. So, most importantly, did Mrs. Enid Poole, widow of a justice and the most efficient transmitter of social verdict within 30 miles. That night, Dristan requested a private interview in the small West Library. Corenza nearly refused. Then she remembered what refusal had cost them once before. She said yes. Rain tapped the windows. The fire burned low and even. For one dangerous instant, the room felt too much like the sort of place where 6 lost years might ask to be mourned. Dristan stood by the map table with one hand resting flat against its edge, as though keeping himself from crossing the distance between them. "You should never have had to endure this alone," he said. "You are late in discovering it." "I am aware." "Are you?" Her control thinned at last. "Because the last time my life was being weighed in rooms full of men, you accepted silence as explanation and left me to preserve what dignity I could manage." His face changed, not with offense, with pain disciplined into listening. "I knew there was pressure," he said after a long moment. "I did not know there was bargaining through your brother's debts. My uncle assured me the discussions concerned timing, not compulsion." "You believed him?" "I believed," he said quietly, "that if you told me not to fight, fighting might become another way of forcing myself into your life." Corenza turned away. The honesty of that landed worse than defense would have. "I thought if I told you the truth," she said, staring at the dark pane, "you would either pity me or attempt to repair it with your name. I could not bear either. And so you taught us both what silence costs." She closed her eyes. There it was. Not accusation, not absolution. The shape of the wound itself. When she turned back, he had not moved closer. He was still, waiting. "Ashberry means to force credit pressure," she said. "He has been seeding doubt among lenders and neighboring trustees, If he can make Ravenfield look unstable under female management, he can either compel marriage on favorable terms or buy pieces of distress once I am weakened. Do you have proof? Fragments, not enough for a room like tomorrow's. Then let us build enough. That was how the alliance began, not with a kiss, not with forgiveness, with work. Over the next 36 hours, Ravenfield became a house of private investigation disguised as hospitality. Mrs. Tolliver, Corenza's longtime housekeeper, quietly produced a tray ledger showing which visitors had been admitted at what hours. The kennel master remembered Ashberry questioning stable lads too closely about late-night callers who had never existed. Corenza's clerk, a nervous but honest young man named Peter Vale, admitted he had received 2 inquiries from London credit intermediaries using nearly identical phrasing about her future domestic settlement. Dristan sent for his solicitor and for a discreet former steward now serving one of his northern properties. He also did something more useful than power. He listened to Corenza. She laid out the pattern across the green baize of the map room table, timing of the gossip, pressure points on credit, invitations shifted after certain conversations, committee influence around the hunt, names appearing together too often to be chance. Dristan followed each thread without interruption. By midnight, they had something close to structure. By dawn, they had motive. Ashberry was overextended. He had borrowed against racing losses and speculative mineral leases in the West. If he secured Ravenfield through marriage or frightened it into financial vulnerability, he could stabilize himself through her land, shooting rights, and projected timber receipts. But greed alone was not enough to expose him. They needed a hand behind the letters. Corenza found it where most men would never have looked. In the household copybook of outgoing notes kept by her father's former secretary and tucked improperly among old committee papers. One folded draft, never sent but heavily corrected, referred to making the county sensible that Miss Whitaker's situation cannot remain independent without risk to all interests attached. Another listed 3 names beside the notation: wives first, men later. Ashberry's hand? No. But the marginal abbreviations matched a card invitation in his own known script. Dristan looked up from the page and said, very softly, "He has been using women's concern to launder male appetite." "Yes," Corenza answered, "because slander travels farther when it wears a bonnet." There was fierce respect in his eyes then, and something else, grief perhaps, that he had ever mistaken her pride for coldness. The decisive evidence came from a direction neither of them expected. Lady Maris Bell, one of Ashberry's recent flirtations and the bored daughter of a baronet, requested to see Corenza in private before the closing supper. She arrived in plum silk and irritation. "I dislike being made ridiculous," she said without preamble. "Lord Ashberry told my mother he was nearly engaged here. Then he told my cousin you had some sentimental attachment elsewhere and would soon need saving from your own management. This morning he had the vulgarity to imply that your house ran on impropriety and that his intervention had become charitable. I do not require romance from men, Miss Whitaker, but I do insist upon originality in their lies." She then produced, from a reticule narrow enough to make deception comic, 2 letters Ashberry had written to her brother in town. One discussed the advantage of publicly rescuing Ravenfield from feminine misrule. The other made explicit reference to tightening local opinion before the Duke reawakens old nonsense. There it was. Not merely slander, strategy. He had known Dristan's history with Corenza and meant to get ahead of it by degrading her first. Corenza read the letters without trembling. That was the triumph. 6 years earlier, such proof would have felt like a judgment against her. Now, it felt like a weapon correctly named. The closing supper of the hunt became the stage. It took place in Ravenfield's long gallery, beneath ancestral portraits and candlelight so flattering it had hidden mediocrity for generations. The county assembled in silk, black coats, jewels, and appetite. Ashberry arrived brilliant with self-satisfaction, still believing the day belonged to his version of events. He even tried to reclaim charm at Corenza's side before seating. "My dear Lady Whitaker," he murmured, "I hope this morning's excitements have not distressed you. Public life is so unforgiving toward delicate reputations." She looked at him and felt nothing of the old tightening now, only clarity. "Then you must be trembling for your own," she said. He laughed. He should not have. After the second course, before the musicians were called, Dristan rose and requested the room's indulgence for a matter concerning false reports made under Ravenfield's roof and beyond it. Conversation died. Ashberry's smile held, but less easily. Dristan did not dominate the floor long. That was the brilliance of what followed. He named the issue. He stated that Lady Whitaker had been subjected to malicious insinuations intended to impair her standing and to influence financial opinion regarding her estate. He then said, with deliberate precision, "The relevant facts are better presented by the person whose intelligence made their arrangement visible." And he sat down. A woman stepping into silence after a duke yields it to her is more powerful than a duke speaking for her in the first place. Corenza felt the room understand that even before she stood. She spoke without rush. She outlined the pattern of inquiries, the mirrored phrases, the effort to convert gossip into credit pressure, the use of female social channels to legitimize male greed. She presented the memoranda, the copied queries, Lady Marysbell's letters, and finally a statement from the London intermediary confirming that inquiries about Ravenfield's stability had originated through Ashberry's representative. No theatrics, no trembling outrage. Only fact after fact laid down with the precision of a woman who had spent too long surviving men's assumptions to waste victory on noise. The gallery changed around her. One could feel the moral current reversing. Not because society had suddenly become just. Society never does. But because a room that had been enjoying a woman's possible humiliation discovered, with collective horror, that it had nearly assisted a vulgar financial trap. Ashberry attempted denial, then wit, then gallantry offended, then attack. He said she misread natural concern. He said she overreached. He said a lady so practiced in account books might easily turn ambiguity into accusation. That was when Corenza delivered the blow that made retreat impossible. "No, my lord," she said, holding up his letter to Lady Maris's brother. "Ambiguity is what men like you require when trying to turn a woman into an estate strategy. Precision is what ends you." A sound moved through the room that was not quite a gasp and not quite satisfaction. Better. Recognition. Lady Maris stood and confirmed the letters. Mrs. Poole, who had been one of the chief consumers of the rumor mill, coldly asked whether Lord Ashberry meant to deny his own phrasing. The justice's widow requested the intermediary's name. A retired admiral snorted that the man ought to be thrashed. Even those unwilling to champion Corenza understood at once that Ashberry had made himself socially radioactive. He left before dessert. He did not leave gracefully. Afterward, as the room broke into strained pockets of conversation and relief, Corenza realized her hands were steady. Steady. Not because Dristan had rescued her, because she had stood where they meant her to fall and made the shame return to its owner. Dristan came to her only when the worst of the crowd had dispersed. "No one in this county will risk repeating him now," he said. "Some will," she replied, "but they will do it more quietly." He inclined his head. "A practical victory, then. The best kind." There was a pause full of all they had not yet repaired. Then he said, "I meant what I said this morning. About disliking convenience. About courting you. Openly. Properly. With no bargains behind it." Her breath caught despite herself. "You think one evening of document work and public scandal entitles you to begin again?" "No," he said. "I think 6 years of regret entitles me to ask." She ought to have made him work longer. Some private part of her still intended to. But love, when it returns honestly, does not always arrive asking permission from pride. "You may ask," she said. And so he did. The courtship that followed was not gentle in the usual sense. It was careful, deliberate, and stripped of romantic lies. Dristan came often to Ravenfield, sometimes to ride, sometimes to review drainage maps or tenant appeals because she refused to be admired only in drawing rooms. He wrote letters that answered hard questions. He apologized once, only once, but with such exactness that no repetition was needed. "I should have asked whether silence was protecting you from me or from something around us," he said. "Instead, I treated your refusal as complete truth because it spared me the humiliation of pressing further. That was pride wearing the mask of respect." Corenza folded that sentence away like something costly. Very few men ever diagnosed themselves so accurately. In turn, she told him what she had never told anyone. How frightened she had been of becoming a financial bridge between men. How much she had hated needing protection in legal language. How deeply she had mistaken self-erasure for strength. Their affection returned by degrees, but stronger for the honesty beneath it. He learned the rhythms of Ravenfield as it actually lived, not as county fantasy described it. She saw the burdens of his title not as excuses, but as structures he worked daily not to become. He deferred when she knew the estate better. She trusted him where political muscle mattered more than solitude. Each discovered the other no longer as memory, but as adult fact. Then, 3 weeks into the restored courtship, another problem forced speed. Ashberry's allies, though publicly quieted, were not all financially harmless. One creditor behind his speculative losses attempted to attach a nuisance action to disputed hunting access near Ravenfield's northern boundary, hoping to alarm lenders before winter. The claim would not prevail eventually, but eventually is a word predators love. If allowed to linger, it could still trouble contracts, tenant confidence, and royal favor associated with future sporting invitations. Dristan saw at once what Corenza also understood. A public engagement might steady perception. A marriage would shut the door. He hated the necessity of that logic because it looked too much like the old world that had once driven them apart. So when he came to her with the matter, he spoke plainly. "I will not ask for haste unless haste serves you more than it serves appearances." Corenza stood in the south gallery, where late sunlight turned the floorboards to gold. Outside, dogs ran the lower slope, and one groom shouted toward the paddocks. This was her house, her decision, her life. At last, truly hers. "If I marry you quickly," she said, "it must not be because scandal cornered me into gratitude. It will not. It must not be because a duke improves my market standing. It will not. It must be because loving you no longer asks me to disappear." Something in his face gave way then, not to triumph, but to relief so deep it nearly looked like pain. "Then marry me," he said, "because I have learned that loving you requires the opposite." She said yes. They were married within 10 days in the small stone church above Ravenfield village, under a sky too clear for drama, and before witnesses carefully chosen for reliability rather than grandeur. There were whispers, of course. There are always whispers when speed follows scandal. But the whispers no longer controlled the story. Corenza did. She entered the church not as a damaged woman being redeemed by rank, but as an estate mistress choosing alliance with a man who had finally learned how to stand beside her without taking the work from her hands. Marriage did not erase difficulty. Good marriages rarely do. It reorganized it. Dristan used his influence to suffocate the nuisance suit before it metastasized. Corenza renegotiated 2 lending arrangements on terms far more favorable than Ashberry had expected possible. Together, they restructured sporting leases, improved game cover management, and established clearer paper trails for estate authority so that no future whisper campaign could so easily convert femininity into doubt. They also fought. Not cruelly, productively, about staff loyalties, seasonal expenditures, whether his London secretary was too smooth to be trusted, whether her instinct to handle everything herself was courage or habit. The difference now was that conflict no longer threatened annihilation. It sharpened understanding. 2 years later, at another autumn gathering under another cold, bright sky, Ravenfield looked less like a vulnerable prize and more like a living domain secure in capable hands. Tenants spoke of improvements in the lower marsh drainage. Gamekeepers bragged about the season. Mrs. Poole had become, through the practical alchemy of social survival, one of Corenza's loudest defenders. Lady Marysbell was engaged to a barrister with an ironic sense of humor. Ashberry had vanished into reduced circumstances on the continent, where men with damaged reputations and unpaid dreams often go to complain about female influence. Corenza stood once again on her own lawn, this time with a child in a nursemaid's arms inside the nursery wing, and Dristan in discussion with the huntmaster about a boundary fence she had already decided to move. He caught her watching and came toward her through the sunlight. "What judgment passes now, Lady Ravenmore?" he asked. "That you are about to agree with my fence plan and pretend it was your notion?" "Never. I should claim credit more elegantly than that." She laughed, and the sound felt like wealth. Then his expression changed into the private one she still loved most, the one reserved not for duchesses or county witnesses, but for the woman who had once refused to let herself be negotiated away. "I was thinking," he said, glancing over the fields, "that scandal has improved this house remarkably." "It was not scandal," she replied. "It was exposure." He bowed his head slightly. "Yes, yours, mine, his, the county's. And what have we learned? That if a fool tries to ruin my wife in public, I should arrive sooner. Better," she touched his sleeve. "And if a woman is underestimated long enough, she may one day make a room regret discovering how much she understood." His hand covered hers. "On that point," said the Duke of Ravenmore, looking at her as though 6 lost years still humbled him, "I have been grateful to be corrected." The hunt horn sounded across Ravenfield. The dogs answered, servants moved, riders laughed. A child cried once upstairs and was soothed. The house held, the land held, and the love they had once lost to pride and social machinery had become, through courage, proof, and second choosing, something stronger than innocence had ever been. That was the final justice of it. A man tried to turn rumor into leverage, and instead drove 2 people back toward the truth. A woman they meant to shame stood still long enough to redirect shame where it belonged. And what might have become county scandal hardened under her hand into legacy. Not perfect, not untouched, but respected, loved, and entirely her own.